the message within 30 minutes. We, the people, had the message, and we were getting it out. Because the media, we, the people, had the message. I went on the phone, and I started recording, and I'd never done anything like this before, and I just said, well, we have to live stream this. And what happened was the message within 30 minutes. We, the people, had the message, and we were getting it out. Because the media didn't show up. The media walked away as soon as the news cycle was over, as soon as the thrill was gone. They allowed the FBI to block the roads and not let them cover the news. They allowed Pete Santilli to go to jail and not stand up against it, because the media, every bit as much as the people, was violated this past month. And they seem to be asleep to that. But guess what? They're coming for you too, news media, because the government doesn't respect you either. And the moment you're not useful to them, they will happily lock you in a cage as well. But what happened last night was the Patriots controlled the message. And so all of you watching, spreading, sharing the videos, the media, and I'm seeing socialist liberal rags, you know, like the Spokesman Review, and they're putting out articles saying, wow, this was unprecedented. The media was absolutely blown away. Nathan was fielding so many calls in the background from national networks, and they're just like, well, can we use your live stream, et cetera, et cetera. And we're like, whatever, go ahead. But the point is, they didn't get to control that message. The message was simply what was happening. It was real news, but it was also the message of what Oregon was all about. And so the raw audio that was aired the past 2 days, it was very raw in every sense. It showed our imperfections, it showed our weaknesses, and you know what? We've got a lot of them. But we had one thing that the FBI hasn't counted all this time, maybe two. We have a voice, and we have God. Now, it's clear by the actions of the FBI last night as they tried to goad these men into violence. And think about this. When people try to control the narrative, take the narrative back. Because what they're trying to do now is say, oh, well, they were interfering with negotiators, or the FBI did great and they got this calmed down. The FBI did not solve this. And consider this. This will go down in history. An FBI negotiator is in the background on a megaphone trolling and goading the people that he is supposed to be negotiating with. Was that FBI Mark? Same guy?
Yes, I believe it was. I'm not positive.
And so we could say, well, admittedly, he did better today, presumably. A lot of people were watching today as well. You know, we had 30,000 people watching this morning. But let's make no mistake. These people did not act as law keepers. They acted as the terrorists. And in this entire course of events that we've seen in the past, 41 days, the government, in every possible sense, has been the criminals. And that is key to remember. And as we talk about that, what I actually want to do, I'm just going to bring up a few things as we go through this. And I don't want to keep this too long. I want to keep this under an hour. A long day. But we looked at what happened today, and then they arrested Clive and Bundy last night, and this ridiculous slew of charges they're bringing against this man. And it really made me think of the declaration. When I was reading the declaration at the end of the live stream, because I didn't know what else to do, I wanted to keep it going for a little longer in case Michelle called, and I'm like, well, we don't have much to say. And so I said, let's read the declaration. And one thing struck out at me, and I saw it and thought, wow, this really applies to what's going on with the Patriots, with Clive and Bundy, all these things. Because the government is so out of control at this point. The law is so gone. And the part that jumped out at me is it said, or it was talking about the king, and he said, to subject to us a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. What our legislators are doing all over this country is pretended legislation. Now, we have some good legislators, a very, 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 very few of them. But we have a few of them, like Michelle Fiore, who are stepping up and putting themselves on the line. Fiore, I'm sorry. So it raises the question, though. These legislators, they're always talking about, oh, well, we've got a new bill and we're doing this and that. And okay, fine. That's a legislator's job. But we need to get serious, too. Because at this point, the country has so far gone, the chief role of a legislator, certainly on the federal level, really largely on a state level. The sheriffs and county officials should, of course, be defending physically the people against violence from government and from anybody else. But the legislators at this point, there's so much law that it's absurd. The problem is not lack of law. And so legislators, I think maybe they should start repealing laws more than making new ones. But let's get one thing clear, and you need to start sending a strong message to your legislators, because I'm seeing this a lot, even from respectable, principled patriot legislators. We don't need you to make new laws to protect the laws, to protect the laws, to protect the laws that protect the Constitution, that protects our rights. Adding more laws on the back of an already lawless government who flagrantly violates the fundamental principles of liberty will do nothing, for the most part, to restore this nation. It's not working. Your legislator stuff is not fixing the country, guys. And it doesn't mean that a legislator shouldn't legislate in certain instances right now, but let's start getting legislation that undoes. Undoes. Nathan's correcting grammar over here. This legislation that is constantly abusing us. But I want to go further than that, because if we go back to when the Constitution was being penned, and Alexander Hamilton and others said this wasn't a new principle. This went back far before the American Revolution. And it was this, that legislation that defies the Constitution, or that defies natural law, even better, is not law. Now, you can take it back further to people like William Blackstone. And they said, well, any law that violates the law of God is not law. And so let's take that back further. Because you know what the number one cop-out, especially with professing Christians, but the government uses it, they love it, they reel us in on it, is Romans 13. Now, there's some powerful, well-spoken men that have spoke on the Romans 13 issue. And so I'm not going to go into a sermon on Romans 13, but let me just take Romans 13:1. We need to own the narrative. They always say Romans 13, oh, the Bible says obey government. What I do before any preacher can foist that nonsense on me is I use Romans 13 for the conversation. I don't hide from it anymore, because people say, well, Romans 13 says there's no law but of God. And Nathan, would you grab me Romans 13:1 just so I can write here? You know what? Let me do it right here. It's been a long day. Normally I can quote that one, but let me just make sure I'm doing this right. Okay, so Romans 13:1. Now we could turn this into a Bible study, but I won't. But this is the one. They use this more than anything else on us. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore, verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Let's be very clear, because this argument ends in Romans 13:1. Let every soul, everyone, including the rulers, God is not a respecter of persons, let every soul be subject to the superior, the higher, Greek from the Strong's 52:42, the higher powers, the higher magistrate, the higher influence, the higher jurisdiction. Strong's 18:49 in the Greek. Let every soul be subject to the higher authority, for there is no authority but of God. And the powers that be, the authority that exists, is from God. God does not create wicked authority, my friends. God does not give authority to evil. We have evil rulers because we are an evil nation. And so God gives us the free will to mess things up, and we've sure made a mess of it. But Romans 13, and nowhere else in the Bible, tells us to obey wicked government. And guess what? Jesus didn't do it. The apostles didn't do it. Have you ever thought about Paul? Have you ever read the Bible and it's talking about Paul being lowered down in a basket? It's talking about Paul fleeing from the government. Have you ever heard of felony eluding? See, if you and I run from the government, we go to jail, and the church says, the professing church says, oh, he should have obeyed the law. That's what the law says. Because we're a lawless nation. But that's not law. Now, this doesn't mean that we rush to fight everything. Doesn't mean, of course, that we rush to violence, because we don't. And so let each man be fully persuaded in his own mind. We got to hear God's word. That's the standard for me. And, you know, those of you that don't like that, you might say, well, we have natural law. Okay, if you want to call it natural law, which it is, it's God's law, but it's natural law, God-given rights, however you prefer it. That's law. What these legislators, politicians, judges, what they're making up is not law. Now let's take that further, and let's talk about the court system. Because as all our patriots are sitting in jail, and let's be very clear, we need to be supporting every one of them. We need to be looking for their donation pages. These people put it on the line for you guys. So I better not see, after what we've seen the past 40 days, because there's going to be more arrests to come. This is starting to look more like Germany in 1934 than America. I better not see people just ignoring this. We already failed. And that's why we're here. And so we better start stepping up. The Oath Keepers better start stepping up. The patriot groups, the militias, they better start stepping up. And I recognize that we're on the precipice, and no one wants to say, well, let's go in by force and fix this. And we shouldn't be looking for force. We should be looking for peace, and that's what happened all through this process. But the fact is, the patriot groups that had the ability to show up in Burns weeks ago to make sure that no violence occurred, they didn't do it. They didn't show up. And what they love to do is to point the finger, and they'll say, well, Gavin, you weren't down there. And if I was down there, I probably would not have been able to get the message out and keep talking. But it wasn't that I wasn't willing to be down there. It wasn't my job. I said, look, guys, I'm going to help you get the message out. I'm going to keep it going. The patriot groups have been telling us for years, hey, support us, support our groups. When the day comes, we'll be there. Were they there, America? Did they show up? Did they become the buffer? Did they keep the FBI? Did they stand there en masse peacefully to prevent roads from being blocked? Because if you'd had thousands of men down there, we'd have a very different story. No, not because we instigated violence, because patriots aren't there for violence, because the government is intimidated. You'd be hard-pressed in history to find a peaceful armed body of people that numbers in the hundreds, or especially in the thousands, where government attacks them. It just doesn't happen that often, because government is terrified of the armed people. So kind of bringing this whole thing around. Our guns won't save our liberty. They're just a means by which we protect it. But those alone will not restore liberty. Of course, we're not going to give them up. We need them. They are peacemakers, but they won't restore our liberty alone. We have to be willing to stand principled. And so going forward, we need to recognize in how many ways America has messed up for decades, right on to the past 40 days. We're so concerned with presidential elections and football. I mean, who won the Super Bowl anyway? Who cares? We have real things to deal with, people. It's time to grow up. And I want to talk to the men for a second. Because you guys, the men, have you noticed in this whole thing? The women are stepping up and doing more than the men oftentimes. What's that?
Except for the guy after the arrests.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. We've got a lot of great patriots from both sides of that aisle. This isn't a sex